I know there are lots of meetings that people are coming from, and I was told that one of Dr. Hurtado's main scholarly professional meetings is happening at the same time, so it's really wonderful to see this group here, and not surprisingly, given the really important occasion here today. I'm going to do a brief introduction and then we can get right to it. I am truly honored to introduce our 2018 Social Justice and Education Award honoree, Professor Sylvia Hurtado. I was privileged to the chair of the Social Justice Action Committee this year and was able to bring together the awards committee to evaluate and to go through many esteemed applications and nominations rather. It was just a pleasure to see things that I already knew from the time that I've known Sylvia about the ways that she's contributed, but the way that others in her collegial and personal networks really spoke to the really breadth and strength of her contributions as a scholar, as a teacher and mentor, and as someone who has affected policy and practice through her personal scholarship and personal efforts. Professor Sylvia Hurtado is a professor in the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA, and she directed the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA for over a decade. Previously, she served as the director of the University of Michigan Center for the Study of Higher Education, of Higher and Post-Secondary Education, where she began her academic career and where I first met Sylvia as a faculty colleague at Michigan. Dr. Hurtado's work has contributed to scholarship, practice, and policy. Her research has been crucial to protecting and expanding access to higher education for racial, ethnic, minoritized students, in particular Latinx students, as well as students from many other minoritized identity backgrounds. Her many distinctive scholarly contributions to the social justice agenda include, for instance, a conceptual interdisciplinary framework to analyze the racial climates of colleges and universities, which has become a classic in the field. Her work on the concept of sense of belonging, introduced in 1997 by Dr. Hurtado and her then mentee and later faculty colleague, Deborah Carter, has been influential in many theoretical and empirical works and dissertations, theses, and it has become to be and that concept has come to be understood as a critical aspect of students' experience of inclusive environments in higher education. She has over 100 publications to count to date, focused on ethnic minority college students, campus climate, and diversity in higher education. Her work also includes issues of diversity in the scientific workforce, and she recently engaged in a study of high-achieving low-income students in college. In sum, she has established a body of high-quality scholarship that has helped inform around the experiences of historically marginalized students and enhance their educational and equitable access to learning and attainment opportunities. Just a few of Professor Hurtado's policy and practice contributions include her seminal work as part of a research team for the Michigan Affirmative Action admissions cases, informing the 2003 Supreme Court decision, and she continued to be active in providing research for amicus briefs in the Fisher versus University of Texas case. Among other things, she's chaired the UC Academic Senate Committee on Admissions, changing eligibility policies for California residents. She also served as president of her scholarly association, the Association of the Study of Higher Education, to name only a few. Along with producing scholarship, she works to help higher education institutions apply research-based practices to improving campus climate and enhancing STEM degree and career pathways for students of color, first-gen, and low-income students. In the past few years alone, I was honored to serve with her on 2 National Academies of Sciences committee panels, 2 of many such service contributions for her, where I saw up close her facility in engaging scholars and policymakers from diverse disciplinary backgrounds and philosophical perspectives around the structural, social, and psychological issues that affect diverse students in higher education. Finally, not surprisingly, Dr. Hurtado has also had a strong positive impact on the current and next generation of scholars, of higher education scholars for social justice, having mentored and supported the academic advancement of numerous outstanding and up-and-coming scholars, too many to name at this moment, including many from historically underrepresented and underserved and minoritized backgrounds. Thus, along with her own work, Her teaching and mentoring efforts ensure the field will include other high-quality scholars whose voices, scholarship, and practices will work towards social justice. Without further ado, please join me in acknowledging and welcoming Professor Sylvia Hurtado.
This is a great pleasure because, yeah, Tabby and I sat through good committees and moderate ones when it comes to gender, race, and all those issues, so I'm really pleased. I'm going to start, by the way, I'm totally unplugged. There's no PowerPoint, there's no data point except a single data point. So, the title of the talk was Evolving Research and Teaching in the Transformative Paradigm. We make the path by walking it. Is it a road or path? The original saying is road, but I believe the road to social justice has not been solidly established in many areas of education. There are still many divergent paths made by individual researchers, their collaborators, and students learning how to do this work. I will reflect on my own path and how it has evolved over time, what I learned along the way, and how I and those I walk with continue to learn to work using a transformative paradigm. I'll share a number of stories. I guess this can happen at the end of one's career. When one starts to receive these kinds of awards, it's a sign that I'm getting older. But I hope that the wisdom that I share will be of use to you in whatever stage you are in terms of your career. I want to start with gratitude. I thank the nominating committee and the many individuals who thought of me for this award. I am humbled because AERA and many of the people in this room are fine examples of individuals who forged new paths for others to follow in social justice education. Moreover, there are many colleagues in the education department at UCLA who make it a great place to work in terms of excellence and commitment to social justice in all it does. It was a place where I acquired the empowering skills to ask any question and find answers as a graduate student and postdoctoral scholar. I also want to thank the many individuals who are at important turning points in my work that offered advice and guidance, and also thank the many students, former students, colleagues, and campus-based collaborators and work that sustains social justice effort in education. I want to start with a story called Sensing the Bitterness of Injustice. At some point, you might take a moment to reflect when your commitment or path in social justice education began. There's no common way one begins. Their career engaged in social justice issues, and I suspect that's largely influenced by period effects, larger social historical events that intersect with biological time in one's developmental stage of identity, awareness, and sense of justice. If I were to identify when I began, I would begin in my senior year in high school. And I'm really not sure why this memory came forward, but it started to come forward, and so I said, I'll write about it. I was class treasurer for 4 years, and the first woman to become senior class president by default. The elected male class president had been removed because of his grades. It was the nation's bicentennial. The women's movement was active. Civil rights movement was still fresh, and the war in Vietnam had just concluded. And my predominantly Mexican-American school district was named the poorest in the state of Texas in the Rodriguez school finance case. As class treasurer, I was dealing with the companies that provide class rings, caps and gowns, graduation invitations, and it slipped out in one of the meetings that the company was giving kickback from the sales to the school. I grew suspicious. The secretary in the office let me see the school principal's calendar, and I saw scheduled golf dates with many of the company salespeople, confirming he, white male, and the representatives, white males, socialized often. I grew very suspicious. At our next meeting, I began to ask questions. Where did the money go? Who received it? How come the class officers were not aware of this part of our contract with this company? In a related event, 2 days before commencement, I got a call from the office secretary asking if I would call Walter, a black student I barely knew, to tell him he was eligible for commencement on Saturday. This was 2 days before graduation. I remember thinking, this is one of the poorest kids in our class, and probably the first in his family to graduate from high school. Why were they asking me to call? There was probably some snafu in the central office, and they did not want to talk to the family. Before agreeing to call him, I said, this takes some planning, and if he's able to come, his name should be called even though it's not on the program, and since it was too late to buy invitations, that he be provided seats for his family, and a cap and gown ready for him at the auditorium. So now my graduate students know where I get it from. Anyway, they agreed, and I called him. I told him he was graduating. If he wanted to participate, there would be regalia available for him. Because it was too late for invitations, that he should call all the members of his family to make sure they could come and see him get his degree. I remember there was silence at the other end of the phone. He was stunned to receive the news that he would be graduating in 2 days. So I remember trying to get him to respond and repeated what it needed to do. Show up at the auditorium downtown. It doesn't matter what you wear. You'll be using a graduation gown. You'll dress up there. Bring your family and anyone you want to invite. So we were getting ready that Saturday afternoon for the ceremony, and I was happy to see Walter in the lineup. He was wearing a gown that was slightly off color, not the same quality as the other gowns, but he was smiling big. A few moments later, the principal pulled me aside and asked what I thought I was doing, asking questions of this company, and that there could be consequences. For a split second, I thought, he's threatening to pull me from the graduation lineup. And I told him, the students in our class can barely afford to get new clothes for graduation. And the families go through great expense to buy the gowns and the invitations. Why would anyone profit from the company's high prices? This enraged him, and he sputtered that I owed the company reps an apology. And in that moment, I realized there was nothing he really could do. I was graduating. I was not likely to see him or the company reps ever after today. And that bitterness in my throat was about to disappear. Now my memory goes blank. I'm not sure what I did, but I remember getting in line, and I remember giving a speech. I was salutatorian. And leaving the auditorium, I saw Walter with his family. He got them to come out, and I made a point to congratulate them. Looking back now, I began to understand whiteness and class privilege, corruption and collusion often go together. Sounds like the nightly news. Especially in segregated educational environments, we had to stand up. The next stories talk about waking up with a transformative aim. After being educated among the most privileged of students in the country in elite colleges, I had many more personal experiences and understanding firsthand inequalities. But I was going to learn something about research paradigms. I took about 8 months to think about what I wanted to do for a dissertation after passing qualifying exams. One morning, I woke up and I knew what I wanted to research. There's something about the climate of these college environments that I believed had serious effects for Black and Latino student progress, self-efficacy, and belonging. I wanted to tell that story. I wanted educators to know that these groups from marginalized communities not only viewed these revered environments differently, but also that they were consequences of a hostile environment that required change. In my dissertation, I compared Chicana, Black, and white college students' experiences with the campus racial climate using a national database that was the first to contain any diversity questions. We were fortunate because my advisor permitted us or gave us an opportunity to put some questions on the national survey. I was using Giroux's notion of limiting forms of student resistance to explain what appeared to be anomalous effects. Controlling for other factors, African American and Chicano college students had higher academic self-concepts environments that they perceived to be hostile. I thought they were more critical of their environments and had developed resistance strategies. Well, my advisor did not agree. In fact, we had an almost knockdown, drag-out argument on this theory. It took a feminist researcher, his wife, to point out that we were using different paradigms and epistemologies. I did not understand at the time. All I knew is that we disagreed on theory, method, and interpretation. But now I understand that she was absolutely correct. In writing my first article from the dissertation, thanks to Michael Olivas, who gave me an opportunity to publish it in the Journal of Higher Education, I realized that I had used the experiences of hundreds of college students to actually tell my own story. I was closer to the participants than I had been socialized to believe, not removed from them. The post-positivist paradigm was not suited for how I was using data and theory, so I took a divergent path. Most of my research from that point forward had both quantitative and qualitative components in design to better tell the stories of underrepresented and marginalized communities. I began to show that students were particularly vulnerable at transition points in college to the negative perceptions of the climate in terms of their sense of belonging, which also could be determined by the nature of their interactions with faculty and staff and different forms of engagement with peers. I also began to reconstruct the climate with my colleagues, Walter Allen and Jeff Milam and Alma Clayton-Peterson, into multiple dimensions, contingent on the positionality of individuals and their social identities. Now, the next section I call From Drive-By Research to Involving Communities. A bigger evolution in my work is that it also became more involved with communities to create change in their campus environments. It wasn't until late in my career, however, at the encouragement of Antigone Papademetrio, that I became engaged with the mixed method research community, and I learned about Donna Merton's work, she's at Gallaudet University, on the transformative paradigm. There was now a language for what I was doing that not only mixed methods, but I had a particular axiology, that is, set of beliefs that includes respect and for marginalized communities, ontology, understanding the nature of multiple realities, epistemology, mutual learning across ways of knowing, and engagement of the researcher in co-construction with participants, and method, a paradigm that was friendly to both quant and qual in a mixed methods frame. In addition to power dynamics, attention to power dynamics was an essential part of one's analysis to understand resistance, hierarchical patterns, larger contextual forces from historical legacies, and external forms of influence. It was well suited to a range of studies and paths of scholarship where social justice is pervasive in the research design and process, and ultimately in dissemination and use of findings. Moving from a drive-by research approach to one that engaged people to shape the research and make use of it for institutional change was time-consuming, but well worth the effort, because you could then see the impact. As always, I was learning through experience. My one project where I started this in a large way was intended to be a replication of the Michigan study with 10 campuses. It was called Preparing Students for a Diverse Democracy. I actually had a research team and a campus practice team, and we were engaged. We were actually going to, as a Spencer Foundation person, you're going to lock and load because you're going to be able to provide a lot of this data. Well, at one point, one person on one of the campuses said, wait a minute, is this a campus transformation project? We didn't sign up for that. And I was like, okay. It was a little bit ludicrous for me to think that as an outsider that I could engage 10 campuses in transformation, but you live and learn. I almost decided I would never engage campuses again, but that quickly went away and I proceeded. There are 3 examples of some of the work that I think has involved a transformative paradigm, and you heard a little bit about them, but I think for the most part, the campus climate studies, working with campus teams to provide information on the multiple realities of their diverse and marginalized communities, giving voice to them, ensuring the information is useful to create institutional change was part of that initiative. Implementing the transformative paradigm to guide the latest of these campus-based was very useful in pointing out power dynamics and giving voice to many who felt invisible at the institution. This was something that the institution itself could not point out, and many could not see. For example, a common theme that came up was basically this lack of awareness, or they just don't know constantly, and finally I concluded that that lack of awareness was actually a form of privilege. So another one, of course, was the research and the University of Michigan affirmative action case. That took 7 years of work, of almost weekly work, with a team, Patricia and Jerry Gurin and Eric Dye. This was before it arrived at the Supreme Court. Our engagement with the lawyers helped us turn our academic language into something that could be understood. There were a series of longitudinal replication studies at the classroom level, the institutional level, and then the national level, replicated across groups and disaggregated by race and ethnicity. So we actually did it every which way. We had to develop a common language so that all could understand the benefits of interaction in diverse campus environments across both majority and minority communities. It was a transformative paradigm in terms of action with the university to achieve its aims. And we understood the result could have been, and still could be, negative at the level of the Supreme Court. But it was important for us to provide a rigorous and systematic way of looking at this. And it was pretty, I remember the lawyers, the first time we talked to them, they said, well, what are the findings? And we said, it's amazingly consistent. And they said, what does that mean? Well, social science research is not very often consistent across all those replications. For us to conclude this, we were excited, but they couldn't understand our excitement in that regard. But anyway, explaining to them, we taught them regression, we taught them all of that, and we eventually began to speak the same language, and they did a good job. Another highlight illustrative of the transformative paradigm in my career comes as a result of research and policy work with the California Academic Senate. Working with colleagues across the UC campuses, we conducted a series of simulation studies to understand the racial ethnic impact of changing the construct of eligibility for college in California. That is, we had this formula, and every time we stuck with the formula, the only thing we would do every year was raise the GPA because more people were interested in coming to college, right? We were tired of that. We said, we have to change the construct. We have to rethink it. We kept an eye on Black, Latinx, Native American, and the most underrepresented Asian groups to see how these populations were projected to respond to some of the changes. So every time we made some estimate, we actually looked at across all those groups. We also conducted longitudinal predictors of students with completion. What resulted was a series of recommendations, and the most important, or one of the key ones, was that the 3 achievement tests used in admissions were a huge barrier for many students who would otherwise be eligible for admission to UC. In fact, we saw there were many students that were very good and much better than the ones that were eligible, but because they didn't take those 3 additional achievement tests, they were not eligible. The results were shared across the UC system. As with any major change in admissions, it requires approval of the academic senates at each institution. We showed how little predictive value these tests added, and that we now had much more information about California schools and their curriculum to make better admissions decisions. It was unanimously approved by faculty senates across the system of the university. And removal of the tests also accelerated comprehensive review of students within the context of their schools. It helped to regain some diversity in admissions under the constraints of race-neutral policies, which had been approved by the voters in the state. It did show that faculty constructed eligibility, and it could be deconstructed and reconstructed with the help of research to be more socially just. So now I want to talk a little bit about transformative practice, and this gets into some of the teaching transformations. I'm glad my colleague is here. The same principles of the transformative paradigm is applicable to teaching and mentoring practices that are implemented where social justice concerns for equity and inclusion are pervasive. The theories and principles that guide the pedagogy of intergroup dialogue fall under the umbrella of the transformative paradigm of practice because it builds relationships, creates an awareness of privilege and oppression for marginalized communities, recognizes power dynamics, and moves participants from awareness to action. The instructor is a facilitator, but is not neutral when it comes to issues of harassment, discrimination, and bias. In my transition to teaching diversity courses at UCLA, because so many other instructors and my colleagues already had done fine points of theory and research in the area, I decided to convert my course from abstract discussion to dialogue and action. Engaging students with commonalities and differences across multiple social identity groups. I'm indebted to Jimena Zuniga for teaching me that conflict is a learning opportunity, and to change or flip the tables on teaching to create a more mutual learning environment. Engaged in this practice for 10 years now, I can say that I continue to learn from participants, and I'm heartened by their passion for not simply developing a complex awareness, but also willingness to take action in their immediate and future environments. I basically tell the class, we're going beyond woke. That's just stage 2. Woke is just stage 2 in this model. So I thank my students for giving me hope before I go home and turn on the news. My teaching has evolved into exploring transformative practices that foreground equity and inclusion, and I continue to learn how to improve techniques, engage reluctant participants, and connect individuals on a personal level with the materials and with each other. In conclusion, I want to say I continue to find my divergent path, but also walk with others, and have enjoyed the company along the way. I share this award with many others that have felt the bitterness of injustice, that have fought for ideas that were not initially validated, who have felt marginalized, who have found empowerment, and those who use research to transform their institutions. As a high school student, I wasn't exactly sure what I could do. All I know is that principal was not there for much longer, and the demographics have changed, and the Latinx leadership is more empowered in that city than the one that I knew growing up. Although there will be many more divergent paths, and others forging paths of resistance and innovative ways of addressing social justice in education, I follow the transformative paradigm as a better map of how divergent paths converge into a road for others to follow in social justice work. I hope it's useful to you and wish you the best of luck. Thank you. Thank you. So now we can just have a conversation, right? Any questions about anything? There's a microphone where I think. Yeah.
Why was your black high school classmate so marginalized? I thought you were
Yeah, so the question was basically, why was a black student so marginalized? It was basically like 95% Mexican-American high school, and the percentage of black students was probably around 3–4%, and I think there were 3 white people in this school. We were located on the west side, and it was high poverty. My own background looked middle class compared to the poverty that many of the students faced, both Mexican American and African American. My guess is that he was in extreme poverty. He was one of the kids that was in extreme poverty. And so I think that's why he was so surprised to graduate, actually, is because there probably was a lot of struggle and passing of classes and everything. The question of why it was called, I still wonder. Why did they call the senior class president to call him? So my guess is somebody made a mistake in the office, didn't do their job. That's what I think. And maybe even a bit of racism and not wanting to call and talk to the family. I don't understand it. Yeah, aisle 7, yeah. So I ended up doing it, but I made sure that he had everything he needed. And it was somebody I didn't know very well, but you know, as class president, you look out for everybody, right? And he was one person I thought, wow, he needs to be there. He needs to be there, so. Catherine.
So, hi, I'm Catherine. Sylvia, you're my advisor. So, we talk about this all the time, but the question that I always have is that in this time, I get really deflated when I think about the status of our country and where we are, and like, what's the point of research and what's the point of moving towards social justice? And so, you know, a lot of us are burgeoning and young scholars who are trying to find our place. And so, could you just share a little bit about when you face those struggles, like how did you get through to be where you are, and like what are expectant challenges that we should be getting ready for?
Well, there's certainly people in this room who have a lot of experience and even know what it was like before Brown. So it's work that you do because it's the right thing to do, and you keep doing it. And as I said, there are social historical moments, right, that inform what some people call them windows of opportunity for change, and then others, a time where I don't even want to discuss or describe what we have going on now. But the thing is there are, I mean, we have to rely on each other for hope, right, in some of this work. And so I'm very pleased because you know, I'm just like one iota compared to the great people we have done this work for many, many years. And as I said, they took the divergent path. They were not considered mainstream, though some of their ideas now are we think of them as now fairly mainstream. So you have to really just realize that this too shall pass. Time passes. And the question is, you stay committed to the goal. That's why I say social justice aims, right? Pervasive in the research, because that's what it's going to keep you going, to try to ask questions, find answers, find better ways of implementing practice, and using that information for institutional change. So I do, and I have seen, if you think about the California Academic Senate story, for the most part, that was data that changed policy, not just policy, but minds of faculty. We don't need that test. And of course, we started doing analysis on the other tests to see how far we could go, but we didn't get to. We said, okay, that's another day. That's for another day. But what happened was amazing is demand. I mean, you see the high numbers of application now to UC because you don't have that barrier any longer. And every community benefited. Of course, the admissions offices have a lot more work to do now. But it shows you the demand, right? The demand for our education, and that we really have to serve that. We have to serve that demand. So there was once a time we never thought that we could never change that construct, but it took years also. It wasn't, see, I was on the committee for like 7 years. And from the day that I joined, the chair was interested in doing this. And we figured out a way, and we work with folks at Berkeley, and some of these people are really well known in social justice areas, but then there were also scientists and people who study bugs and things like that. They were all in this committee, and they were convinced. So you don't know, right? You don't know who's going to be on the committee and what decisions, but it was a key decision point. And so we have to imagine a society we aspire to become. And that's where we put all of our efforts, I think. Not the one that we are currently living in. So thanks for that question.
Hi, I'm Andrew Shira. I'm a teacher in Philadelphia, and I teach social foundations in the teacher ed program too. Hi. I guess just hearing you talk about the ways in which woke is just phase 2, oftentimes social foundations becomes more about just consciousness and not action. So I guess I'm wondering what advice you have for us in preparing teachers at the beginning of their career to be able to imagine themselves taking those first steps to be actors for social justice.
That's a really good question. I was a teacher in training and teaching, I shared this with Stella, outside of Trenton in New Jersey, so not too far from here. And students who got kicked out of Trenton would go to Ewing, and I was a student teacher at Ewing for the year, my senior year. It was very difficult because the first was the structural issues. It was a really strong, I'm not sure if it's still in place, probably so, tracking system. That was extremely discouraging for a new teacher because not only did you have to just develop multiple curricula, but students could never get a grade higher than C if they were below average. They could never get out of the lower tracks. That stunned me, and because I said, okay, well, let me alter the curriculum so that their level, all of that, and I was giving A's, and the teacher said, oh no, these students don't get A's, because then they would have to move them out of that track into the next track, and I was like deflated. Very deflated, because it was a structural issue. The kids they had all their issues, everything that you would imagine, and they even had kids in that school system that probably were ADHD, but they were in the lower track and kept there, but very bright. And they were disruptive, but they were bright. They should not have been in the lower track. And I could see this, and I couldn't change it. But of course I was a student teacher, so they didn't even pay me. They didn't even pay me. So I can see this. Now, we train students at UCLA to teach in the inner city, and they are strongly passionate, and they are resistors, and they're enforcers, and the teachers in the schools love them because they're all about what we do, how do we get change going. So I think what's helpful is to find like-minded individuals and work with them, because you have to sustain each other in the work that you're doing. And anything you can do to change those structures that are holding students down is very, very important. So it's not just learning the content and mastering that and transferring the knowledge. It really is a lot about changing things so that it makes life easier for those students. So thank you for your work. I couldn't do it. I got so discouraged, I said, I better do something else. Think I'll do admissions. I think I'll do admissions. I did admissions for 2 years before going to grad school.
Thank you for your remarks, Sylvia. I'm just curious, just thinking about people who are in different stages of their career and career development. When you took on or kind of became aware and took on the transformative paradigm in terms of the way that you kind of approached knowledge and epistemology, can imagine that wasn't received so well in all the different spaces that you might have occupied within our mainstream higher education spaces. So I guess in line with some of the other questions about kind of how you approached from a place of integrity, but also a place of strategy, what you understood and knew about the value of different types of knowledge and forms of knowledge that weren't historically valued, how you navigated those contexts, particularly those where evaluation of your work was involved, that had real implications for your career pathway.
That's a great question. Thank you, Tabby, for that. Well, you understood. I just gave you a story when I was a high school student. I don't really easily back down. So I think that was one thing, is that if I believed something was right, including the research, I mean, I'm willing to accept. I think one thing my advisor did, he did train me in how skeptical people would be of all of this work, and how it would, if it didn't follow exactly the post-positive paradigm, how it would be attacked. And so I had to I realized fairly early on, he taught me pretty much what the standards were, right? The standards. So what I needed to do then was really think through, in everything that I did, what would my harshest critics say about this work as I'm putting it out there? And especially when you're doing experimental things, right? So what would my harshest critics say about this work? And it was basically then trying to reframe and rethink, not change what I wanted to do. As you know, I don't usually back down, but really thinking about how do you bring them to understand either the perspectives of these communities, or your approach, or your different way of thinking, or even different way of doing research. And so I think people that are working on the boundaries of what is the conforming norms are really the people that are doing most exciting work. In other words, if you stay in the box, like there you are. But if you're pushing those boundaries, you're actually you're advancing the field, you're advancing social justice, right? So it's a real hard thing, because you have to have enough confidence in what you do to a certain extent, or at least people who support you and believe in what you do, so that you can move forward, or help you shape and help you frame what you do. So I think I'm talking in generalities, but I've had a lot of pushback from reviewers of the research, obviously. And I remember one in particular. I was doing a study of Latinos transition to college, one of my favorite pieces still. And it had quantitative and qualitative data in it, both mixed method for early 90s. That was still pretty. And the external reviewer said, oh, get rid of that. You don't need the alternate, you don't need the qualitative stuff. It's a perfectly good quantitative study. And it came back to me, and I was like, no. I'm not going to change that. But I had to then provide a rationale and educate the person. And I used one example. I said, in this particular question we asked, we said, who supported you the most in college or during college? And we had a list of people. Well, we did not, and not sure whose fault it was when we were designing the survey, but anyway, we did not have family listed on it. But the top one from the open-ended qualitative was peers or whatever, and when the open-ended qualitative started saying family, 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 we said, we got to change our survey questions. And this is very important. So I used that example. I said, you would think that family was not important if the question is not asked. I said, when you leave and you allow people to say who supported you the most, there it is. And a lot of these were first generation, college students, all of that. Still, family was very important. So, and to me, it was very important for Latinos to convey that, obviously. So I had to I made the case. I said, what we could not anticipate a priori, we got from the qualitative and were able to provide that. Plus, there was a quote that I loved, and I have it in, I didn't even think they were going to publish it, but it was one of the quotes that I loved because the student said, it was students moving in through their second year, and the student said, well, the first year went pretty well, but the second year is kicking my ass. I said, I'm putting that in the journal. So, and these were high-achieving students. So obviously, I think that was very important. It was the reality of the student. They don't have a place to say that in a survey, obviously. So I think what I did was push back, but I had to push back with rationale and evidence and all of that. But I had a rationale for doing it, not just because I loved it, but that's why it's one of my favorite pieces ever, because it had both their voices, but it also then talked about some very important transition issues. So that just gives you one. I mean, there are many, many others in review processes that are, I had another reviewer in the mixed method study say, why can't you just present all the quantitative first and all the qualitative first? Because that reviewer did not want to read the qualitative at all. We mixed results, which was new, and fortunately we had a mixed method researcher who reviewed and said, you know, there aren't too many examples of how you mix results. This needs to stay. So we went with it, and pushed back. So if I had done what they asked me to do, we wouldn't know what we know, we wouldn't be breaking new ground, etc. So, and sometimes you pay, but like I kind of evaluated the principal. I was like, what am I going to lose here? Nothing. I'm gone. So you can, but the fear, you could imagine the fear, right, of confronting threats or even confronting, potential harm, and some other people actually endure harm for social justice issues. But I think that we can be pretty astute observers and not be dominated by our fears, but really truly evaluate the situation. I think that's probably the best advice.
Hi, Sylvia.
Hi.
First, thank you for an extraordinary career of scholarship and mentoring. And
see, I think I'm retiring already.
I know. A continuing career.
See, I have students here. They're very worried. They're getting very worried.
Okay, career to date. Extraordinary record in your career to date. And you talked a little bit about, with the affirmative action cases and the admissions work, a kind of interdisciplinary approach, which I think is very powerful and very positive. And when we think about social justice and social movements more broadly, they often bring together lots of disparate qualities and characteristics. You know, people that organize movements. Some people play music. Some people make posters. Some people develop goals. Other people just get people to show up. But when we talk about interdisciplinarity in academia, it's mostly within academia. Different kinds of people within academia. Maybe you could talk a little about some of the influences on your work and your life from outside the academy, the kinds of things that helped inspire you and sustain you as you were doing your work within the academy?
Sure, I thought you were going in a different direction in that question, so let me think. I think I'm inspired by, I think I'm still informed by my own background, my own identity, and wondering why some students that were, what I thought in high school were brighter than I was, never went to college. In other words, I don't wonder really, but because we didn't have a college-going culture in our high school. And I have a whole different access story that some students know, actually, which is very strange. We crashed a college night, and we ended up finding out what college was about. And not many of our students from our high school would go to a neighboring district to find that out. And it wasn't even me. Somebody else said, let's go. Jumped into a 67 Mustang, drove over there, and I thought we'd get in trouble. Anyway, I won't go any further with that story, so I think about all of those things, and growing up in a segregated city in San Antonio, it was pretty much what side of town you lived on basically determined the schools, the education, even determined, I mean, when I got to Princeton, they said, oh, well, the only job left in work study is to sell bagels at midnight. And I said, midnight? My mom wouldn't want me outdoors at midnight. Then I said, what's a bagel? I had never seen a bagel or heard what it was or tasted one. It's true. Now I eat them all the time. I watched them make them down the street here, you know, when I was in college. But I didn't know what it was, and I was like, I don't think my mom wants me selling those things. So anyway, but the Chicanos helped me out. I got a job checking IDs at the gym because the Chicanos had a kind of little mafia on the security, whatever. So they helped. Yeah. So they helped me out. Anyway, so and there are actually a lot of people who've helped along the way. Like Frank Ayala was dean. He was actually in grad school at Columbia and became dean of students or assistant dean of students at Princeton, and he had his door open all the time. He ended up going to UCLA and working with Sandy Astin. And when I went to my master's, I realized that that's where I wanted to be. And Frank was someone who, as a assistant dean of students, was just there for us. So I don't know if they were inspiration for my work, because they're inspiration in that I understand the environments that they were working in. And so I want to write more about it, because they were not easy environments. They're never easy environments, but you know, if you're the one and only, you know, you're there, right? So the interdisciplinary part, I really am a sociologist, and working with Pat Gurin is pretty much a psychologist, but I'm more on the social psychology side, and so is she, so that was a little bit easier. But I want to say, and I thought we were going with, when these groups come together, interdisciplinary or not, it's not a pretty sight. Because you are coming from different, yeah, Jimena Zuniga's laughing very loud because she knows. So you negotiate, right? And I remember we had a knockdown, drag out about some of the results for students of color from all of that analysis. I said, oh, we need to write about X. And Pat was very nervous because it kind of addressed the climate, which was my area, right? And Well, it turns out that now the climate, or racial isolation, critical mass, is very important now in the current Fisher case. Well, they're done, the Fisher cases, but the next one's coming up as well. So climate now is introduced, but in that case, the climate information was submitted to the other side, but it was kind of, everybody ignored it until someone pulled it out and said, oh, here's the smoking gun. You know, they just did everything they could to turn anything against us, even though they had all the evidence. So we did things back. We basically produced 35,000 pages of output, and when they asked for our findings, we sent it to them. And you know our good friend Eric Dye, he had this little program called SLIM. He just, those 35,000 pages came down just to the essential numbers we needed, and that's what we used to write our results. But we weren't going to share it with the other side. They were sent the 35,000 pages. So lawyers love when I say that. It's like, oh, you guys know how to do it. Anyway, so the influence. The lawyers were interested in helping us learn how to communicate what we're doing and the results. And Gary Orfield was very useful in bringing people together. So, and he brought lawyers together with social scientists, and is still doing that. And that was extremely useful, because that's when we realized we were not speaking the same language, and lawyers were frustrated. We were like, why don't they get it? You know, so finally we came to a good meeting in terms of what they needed, and then they realized this was extremely compelling and important work, particularly when we presented them a theory of diversity, which they had not even thought of, but they ran with it. They never told us what to find. As social scientists, we just said, what's the question? We'll go answer it. And we came back with some pretty amazing results. So the rest is history, since now we have meta-analysis of all that work and lots of good work happening. So thanks for that. But yeah, the interdisciplinary part, in ideal, it should work beautifully. It's hard. It's hard.
Thank you again, Sylvia. Thank you for your remarks about your pathway, your personal and professional journey, for the work that you've contributed, and for the work you will contribute. You're not retiring.
I'm still working. Yes, that's right. I'm still working. I've got graduate students working out there.
Please join me once again, and
thank you.
Sylvia Hurtado.
Thank you.